going to summer school. Summer school. Ooh, where the kids are cool.
Okay, now, Star Wars and Star Trek, the two most successful science fiction franchises, I think, in history. Which one's better?
Star Trek?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, because I think that Star Trek and Star Wars are very different animals. Mm-hmm. I mean, as Mary very astutely pointed out, Star Wars is a fantasy. Mm-hmm. You know, there's no, whereas Star Trek is basically about how collective humanity can join together, and we're sort of better than the sum of our parts. Mm-hmm. And then it deals with modern issues that we're always going to face as people and as a race. There's none of that in Star Wars. Star Wars is an amusement park ride.
Well, and there doesn't have to be, because it's created in a world that's so removed from us that it doesn't need to make historical reference to anything that's happened to us. I mean, Star Trek happens in a future that is supposed to come from the reality that we're existing in, and so it has to acknowledge all of that. And maybe that leads to a certain, proclivity to constantly making Shakespeare references or whatever.
I don't know. I think Star Trek is coming true, because Barack Obama's president of the United States.
Our first nerd president.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that the 24th century is going to look exactly the way that it does in the film. So yeah, I'm fine with that.
Well, then wait a minute. Do we have the eugenics wars coming up then?
Let's hope so.
That's past, man.
Right?
Yeah, that was in '96, man. And if you read
what happened?
Greg Cox's Star Trek novels about the eugenics wars, they happen in secret.
I always wanted them to do that, the secret eugenics wars.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I far prefer the idea of a future where almost no one is fat. So I think that's a good thing. But I think that it's very difficult to talk about Star Trek and Star Wars just as franchises, because even within those communities, the fragmentation of someone who says Voyager is the best post-original series spin-off, or for me, Deep Space Nine, you're even going to have clashes there. And with Star Wars, people who are loyal to the first film and Empire Strikes Back, and maybe to some degree even Return of the Jedi because of its nostalgic value, and the total disconnect that happens with the prequels, if you try and look at that franchise as a whole too, it's very difficult to say my affinity is for the original story, and I have all of these provisos of why this is good and this isn't good or whatever. I think that's what teaches us over time, that if your franchise lives that long, in a way, I mean, it's like Marilyn Monroe and James Dean dying so young. We can see them preserved in their perfect beauty with all of the possibility of a future. Whereas when they live on forever, eventually it's Farrah Fawcett, where you're eventually eventually it becomes a thing where you watch it.
50-something.
No, gross.
Or Michael Jackson.
60, maybe 60.
My only point is that I think if Star Wars had been left alone, you would never ever find a dissenting voice to say it wasn't the greatest film envisionment of science fiction and fantasy that had happened in its time. And the amount of anticipation that happened before The Phantom Menace came out was so huge. I waited in line for 12 hours in a mall in San Diego to see it at midnight, and I remember leaving afterwards feeling like, I was surrounded by people who didn't want to admit that they didn't like it. I mean, they had so much hope tied up in what it was going to be that they couldn't deal with the fact that it wasn't good.
I think the big problem with Star Wars is when they try to make kids happy. And then you're sitting there going, what the fuck is this Jar Jar
But that
shit?
happened in Return of the Jedi as well, that George Lucas's personal life and his, where his children were in their age and when he got children and all of that, that definitely influenced the storytelling. But I also remember, everybody saying, that's the biggest thing that's wrong with Return of the Jedi is that, instead of the Wookiee planet, we see the Ewoks, because we don't want it to be too scary for the kids. So when we learned that there was going to be a Wookiee planet, that we were actually going to see Kashyyyk, and we were going to see the Wookiees, and it was going to be this badass thing with wars, it was still extremely lame. You see Kashyyyk, and you're like, oh.
For 10 minutes, wasn't
it? Regardless of, the Wookiees themselves did not look interesting, or, it seemed
they were very much an afterthought. You could lift them out of the movie, and the movie would be fun.
What I find really insidious about what's happened with Star Wars is the fact that what they've done with Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker, I think is unconscionable. They have turned a child-killing mass murderer into a hero as a boy. All through the Clone Wars, he's still a hero. And you're supposed to follow his exploits. I mean, you could speak to this. Anakin is a hero until one moment when he's not, and he's suddenly become a child-killing mass murderer. And, you know, I have little nephews that are Anakin Skywalker fans because they have not done a good job of showing Anakin's long fall from grace.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind if you show
We've
how
got
that
4 or 5
person
more series of
can
the
become.
seasons of the Clone Wars to possibly accomplish.
Well, I hope so, because in the movies, they really did. Little Anakin in The Phantom Menace is a really sweet, nice kid.
You kind of want to smack him.
And then, well, that's the acting. But in Attack of the Clones, he's just kind of a dumb douchebag, and then he becomes an irredeemable asshole in Revenge of the Sith, and the story of his downfall is horribly portrayed.
I thought it was wonderfully set up. You show him as this guy who wants to do good, but has this history of, like, his mom was a slave, and he wants to bring order to the universe. Well, that's a good intention.
His storyline should have been the road to hell.
But it just completely goes off this weird thing about saving.
But that makes it sound as if the way that we want to explain the evils of the world is to do a series called Little Hitler. You know, and like, let's see what he was like as a boy and all the things that led him to become a monster, like that. And it's fine if you constantly make it possible for people to see that the monster is the end point.
Little Hitler? I'm in.
I'm sure it's on Crackle.
They did the movie that John Cusack was in about young Hitler.
Oh yeah,
coming back and being an artist and
well, there's also a great
Max.
You cannot get it in America. Grant Morrison comic book series, The Further Adventures of Hitler, which is about him in Britain, asking how he became this monster, and it's a great series. Unfortunate title, which means you can't really get it in America.
I gotta say about Star Wars though, in Star Wars' defense, I really liked the Clone Wars DVD that came out like 5 years ago or something. That was brilliant because it was not targeted towards kids. It was an adult feature, and the animation was great. Also, the original trilogy, no special edition crap, just original, unchanged, I think is pretty good. Although I could do without the Muppets still.
Well, interesting, putting this panel together, it was a lot harder to find nerds to stand up for Star Wars, which makes me wonder, is Star Trek sci-fi for nerds and Star Wars sci-fi for everybody else?
I think that there's still a currency of recognizing that Star Wars has importance to people, and I don't think most people who grew up loving Star Wars have abandoned it. They just feel as if it's a shame that it's gone awry. Like nobody, I don't think that people wake up detesting the original films. They just have a sense of disillusionment about where it could have gone.
That's purely an opinion based on nostalgia. I mean, the prequels have clearly connected in a huge way with worldwide audiences. They were phenomenally successful. Even the least successful of the prequels, Attack of the Clones, by far outgrossed any Star Trek film ever.
They're great looking.
And the merchandising, there are a whole generation of children that grew up with the prequels that love them and will prefer them to the original trilogy. And that's their right as fans discovering a property. They find the original movies boring. They find them slow, and there's yet another generation of fans that has only come to the Star Wars by watching the new Cartoon Network Clone Wars CGI series. They haven't even seen any of the other Star Wars movies, and they love it.
But don't you think that people who, as young boys, grew up watching the original Star Wars and who have whatever life impact that had on them to carry through into adulthood, don't you think the experience for a 6-year-old child watching The Phantom Menace and then the rest of the prequels, that their affinity for Star Wars is based on a whole different set of values and a whole different sense of heroism? I mean, I'm not saying that it's not any more valid for them, but don't you think that it's a different story for them than it is for people who grew up with the original
it's a different,
Star Wars?
It's 25 years later.
The great thing about the first trilogy, you love it as a kid, you grow up and watch it again, and it holds up. I don't know if the prequel trilogy is going to hold up.
No, well, that's
I think that's nostalgia talking.
But
Could be.
I think, though, that one of the things that people forget about the original Star Wars is when it came out, it was like, you literally saw something you'd never seen before. Audiences worldwide had never seen anything remotely similar to what they saw when you see the Tantive 4 come screaming over Tatooine and then the Star Destroyer gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember sitting there as a 10-year-old kid who at 10 loved Star Trek, and I loved War of the Worlds and When Worlds Collide, and I loved Godzilla movies, and I loved it all. But seeing that image was so far beyond anything I had seen before. It was the most mind-blowing thing. I mean, it was literally like having a religious epiphany for me. I mean, it really was. And now all of this stuff is so taken for granted. There's nothing unique about it anymore. And I think that for me as a 10-year-old child, I didn't even know anything like that. It was truly magic.
I mean, that was the same feeling I remember having when I watched the first Jurassic Park. The first time you see the Brachiosaurus, there's this moment of, I remember just sitting there thinking, I just want so much for this to be true. You know, like I just wanted them to really be real.
And
like,
really be grabbing you and
no,
alive.
right. I'm actually talking about the first time we see the Brachiosaurus, which is a very peaceful and beautiful moment.
And a herbivore.
Right. So I just felt like, you know, that was a great like sense of the wonder that you have when film technology makes it possible for you to imagine and believe in the possibility of these things that used to be so far out of reach. And so that was great. But then what ended up happening was a series of additional movies came out and they were crap. And you would watch these movies and think like, okay, but does anyone care about that feeling of magic, or does anyone actually care about what the lesson of Jurassic Park is, you know? Or is it really just about finding more ways to make velociraptors scary, or finding more ways to show Tyrannosaurus Rexes chasing us or fighting with each other or whatever? Like, I mean, it really was, it no longer tried to teach us anything about what the book was intending to teach us, and also what was happening in that period in global history. So I think that when it turns into a successful film that spawns a franchise, it's money. You know, it becomes how do you sell this movie? How do you get butts in seats during the summer months or whatever? And it's not about. I mean, Transformers is a great example of that, because children who grew up loving Transformers didn't necessarily grow up loving them for any of the reasons that the films are being made. But it was, you know, it was a toy that was fun to play with, and it had a great television
into a car.
series. Right, exactly. And that was really all it was. And then by trying to add all of this other layer of meaning to it, and, you know,
Well,
I don't know that Michael Bay is the guy that
Well,
should be.
so with Star
meaning.
Trek versus Star Wars, Star Trek has sustained quality over time, but Star Wars managed to.
You know what? I think both of them, they have their flaws. And it's very difficult to find a sci-fi movie that is perfect. And I've seen very few. You know, the only sci-fi movie that's perfect in my mind that comes to mind is Children of Men. I think it's absolutely
perfect film.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. And I've never seen a perfect Star Trek. I've seen great Star Treks, excellent Star Treks.
2
not
and
a
6
perfect
come
one.
close.
And same thing with Star Wars.
Well,
2 and 4 for me.
What I wanted to speak to about what you were saying about the as far as generational things go and kids today, and what I also think is unfortunate is when I saw The Empire Strikes Back, which to me, it took what was great about Star Wars and magnified it and grew the universe to the point where the possibilities were endless. And to me, in May of 1980, my Star Wars fervor had hit a zenith. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But one of the things that I was then 13 that I thought about a lot was Yoda's teachings. You know, do or do not, there is no try. And I love the whole thing that I took away from that is I remember thinking, wow, you know, it doesn't matter how big you are. Yoda can wield the Force because of his sheer willpower. And it's sort of, this is going to sound strange, but my parents were avid golfers. And when you're golfing, you're not a better golfer because you're stronger. You know, you have to have control over the club, and you have to be able to keep your eye on the ball. And I really thought that the lessons that Yoda was imparting were good ones. And I remember the first time I saw the movie, I didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And when he meets Yoda for the first time, the audience doesn't, this isn't a Jedi Master, this is some crazy toad-like creature that lives in the swamp on Dagobah. You know, and then when that revelation comes, when Yoda says, I cannot teach him, and his voice changes, and I remember sitting there going, oh my God, and having the same effect on me as when the Star Destroyer passed overhead. And these moments were epiphanies for many different reasons. And I don't think the prequels have any of that. Yeah. And I think that this doesn't come down to a generational thing. It comes down to a storytelling element. But the revelations that were in those movies, at least the first two, were they sucked you in, and that's why they have
What about the moment in Attack of the Clones when you realize, oh my God, this movie is about the United States in this day and age. We are watching this grand republic, this bastion of democracy in the galaxy, being manipulated and turned into a villain, a villainous entity. It's becoming the Empire. That was genius. That's what made these movies so relevant.
Well, yeah, but do you think that was? But
why is that less?
Too subtle,
why is that less valid? That's genius?
But because I'll tell you why. Because it's not personal. It's not you're not seeing something in relation to yourself and how it relates to you. When Yoda says I cannot teach him, I realized it was a failing in me that I didn't recognize that Yoda was the Jedi Master. I mean, no, seriously, you as an audience, you are tricked. You're Luke, and you're going on that journey with him, and it becomes personal and internal to you. And then I remember thinking, wow, man, I never judge a book by its cover again.
And that's not to say that there wasn't material in the prequels that is laudable. I think that the
I thought the one great twist in the prequel, I just forgot. All through the first films, you'd think the Empire was some outside force that came in and conquered the Republic. The prequel tells us, no, the Republic collapsed and became the Empire.
Actually, you know what the prequel really taught me? Was that you will always win if you have the higher ground.
Oh, yes.
And if you spin. That's
and
a good trick.
You can avoid being burned by lava. That's how you win. And ultimately, there's still it's so difficult to compare them, and I don't know that it's even meritorious to compare them because they really aren't the same creature at all. That one is a very mature show that was made for mature people that had themes in it that were mature and had adults in it. It didn't have any other than. Clint Howard. You don't see a lot of children in original series Star Trek, and so it's not intended to be that. And I didn't start watching it until I was in high school.
And the one child in Star Trek: The Next Generation did not turn out that great.
Right. Well, my favorite. I think Wil Wheaton's fine, and I have a problem with him, but
I love him. It's just they didn't know how to write for a kid.
But I did love the one episode. You'll remember the episode title, but the episode where they can have whatever they want, and Wil Wheaton's basically his dream is I want to be big, and he turns into this blonde. What's he going to look like when he grows up? And he's this big strapping blonde Sears model.
That was the episode with Q.
Hey, what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was
like that now.
And that was the thing. I was just I've actually seen him grow up, and
I think that was
didn't change
Hyde and Q from the first season.
As I said, you would know.
For me, the Wesley moment that lost it. Sorry to go on the tangent, but the one where they beam down
wait,
the pleasure planet, and you can have any woman you want, but he doesn't. He's not ready for that. There is no 14-year-old boy who does not jump at the prospect of getting action on the pleasure planet.
Okay, speaking to that, that is the episode where Geordi. That's the episode where Geordi, after Wes has become a man, Geordi goes, looking good. And there was all that speculation that they were going to finally introduce the first gay character into Star Trek, but it didn't happen that way.
No.
But that's an interesting juxtaposition too, because the Chris Pine version of Captain Kirk seems to only tell the one-dimensional version of adolescent maleness that we're talking about.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to get to a Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto relationship there.
No, not at all. But I think that they made it so that was also a very sort of clumsy distillation of what Captain Kirk's actual values were. It made him, they really just turned him into, Indiana Jones or Han Solo, that he's that guy who does look twice at a woman and really, even though he's going to find himself in these scrapes and be able to get out of them, it is really important for him to be able to get laid. And that never...
Yeah, he's kind of a jock, which I didn't like.
Well, not just that, but to the point where he's distractible. Even when he's on a mission and where something's really important to him, that he can have his head turned.
Captain ADD.
But I just think that that's a really important distinction.
The USS 1701 ADD.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I really can't stand, if we're back to talking about Romulus being destroyed, is they destroyed the Romulus in the prime continuity, which means that all of the Star Trek novels that have been doing such a wonderful job expanding the 24th century universe now have to deal with the dumb idea of Romulus being destroyed, which I think is just utterly ridiculous and stupid.
They're never going to pay that much attention to the novels, though.
No, they don't. But I pay attention to the novels, and
you'd actually, and I think that that's an overlooked resource, because there are a number of really, really well thought out storylines that exist there. And when you think of how anxious film studios are to find a good story that has already kind of been thought through, that already
They're obviously
has,
not reading.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like if someone were to be able to create, you know, an eye into that content, I think there really would be a lot of great material there for films, for series, for all sorts of things.
Well, I haven't read a lot of them, so I'm probably missing out on good ones. But whenever I read them, they're always
I'm not saying
wouldn't
to
it be
change
cool?
your life, Andy, because
Okay.
really, I mean, it isn't something you want to sit by the pool with
Yeah.
if you want to meet anyone. In my experience, it's not something, it's not a badge of honor necessarily, but if you're jonesing for
Well, the novels
Star
I've read,
Trek,
it's always
that's what's
like,
great.
what happens if the character from this episode gets the weapon from that episode and
There
puts
is
it on
a-
the ship from this episode? Which is fun for a place, but it's not going to be something where I'm going to look for new ideas for the...
Right, whereas the ones that I've liked the best, like the various storylines that I've liked the best, have kind of continued on from where we've already, from everything that we've seen up until now, and given you a sort of a sense of where these characters might go. And I just like the idea of them perpetuating. You know, I just like the idea that they're still alive in the future after the
I
show
kind of don't
ends.
want them to be canon, because I mean, one of the reasons the novel exists is what if this happens, what if that happens?
Right.
You know, they've got the freedom to do the weird stuff that's never going to
Right,
happen in the series.
McCoy is still alive in the Star Trek novel world, so
Yeah.
he manages to perpetuate his life long, long after the
Well,
film.
that's an interesting thing, because you're talking about like DC Elseworld stories when they did like Red Sun, or they would
Yeah.
tell stories that weren't in their regular continuity. Batman could become a vampire, or Gotham by gaslight when it's in Victorian England.
Well, also Vertigo. They've done
Yeah.
some good stuff in Vertigo, too.
Yeah, but I think that we're initially attracted to, if they did a mirror universe Star Wars movie where Han Solo had a beard, you know, I think, you know, it would be great. Or it was Han Solo that was on Tatooine moisture farming, and it was Luke who was flying around the Millennium Falcon. Can you imagine if it was Luke and
I can't
Lando
imagine Luke with a
Calrissian
beard.
together? Like, you know, it's kind of Lethal Weapon in space.
Awesome.
I don't know where that came from, but
Yeah.
I'm going to do that
Yeah,
all.
you have to
Write
do
that
it.
Pitch
down.
Dark Horse, yeah.
Yeah, well, pitch the studio.
The-
See,
the
it could be
mirror
the
universe.
reinvention.
The
The
mirror universe
reinvention of
Star
Star
Wars,
Wars.
yeah.
Lando
Do
and
it,
Luke,
and then
lethal
I'll
weapon.
not, just
Yeah.
not go.
They actually have done that with Star Wars. I forget what it's called, but they did some alternate universe.
Oh,
Star
yeah,
Wars
Oh,
yeah.
really?
Star Wars slightly.
In what form was it? Like
Comic
a-
book.
Yeah,
a comic
they
book?
do.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
They did. And I think that the Dark Empire comics should be the basis for that. Those are really good.
Does that take place after the original
Yeah,
trilogy?
yeah. Which I don't know why they don't. Why doesn't Lucas do that? Why doesn't he just make everybody want?
I
That's
really
what people
don't
want
want
to
him
see.
to, though, after what he did
Well,
with
then
the
he should
prequel.
hire. You know what he should do? He should hire that. He should say, which one of the filmmakers in Hollywood, which one of you all would like to make a Star Wars movie, and he should handpick.
I think we've seen through his career whether or not George Lucas's actual hubris allows him to do that.
Yeah,
though.
he's
That's
I mean,
the
I would love it if he
unfortunate-
would, but he grabs onto those things
Yeah.
pretty tight. I mean, that's one of the things I like about Star Trek. I mean, all props to Gene Roddenberry, but then you got Rick Berman, and then you got Nicholas Meyer, and you know other creative people contributed. You know, and then
No,
you
it's
got
true.
even Brandon Braga. I know
Yeah,
we
who's
don't like some of them, but his
behind
first
Flash
one.
Forward.
Braga.
Who's behind Flash Forward?
Yeah.
Oh well, still might be good.
Hey, he was on. They were on 24 this year, right?
That's true, and he wrote some of my favorite Next Gen episodes, so I should not
yeah.
badmouth him.
I like the guy.
Yeah.